I have always been drawn to some of the darker stories in The Lord of the Rings, such as the Barrow-wights, the Silent Watchers, and the Nameless Things of Moria, and I find it fascinating how the Caves of the Forgotten are often overlooked. As a fate or concept, I find it to be quite horrifying, and I'd like to share my thoughts behind this. Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode we'll be exploring the Caves of the Forgotten. So after Sauron corrupted the Numenoreans, he managed to convince their king, Ar-Pharazon, to attack the lands of the Valar, to demand and take immortality. Old age had started to creep upon the king, and he was so terrified of death that he ordered his shipbuilders to assemble a great fleet, and he began to muster a huge army. Now, even though men were banned from traveling to Aman, Ar-Pharazon's pride had grown so much that he chose to disregard this, and he led his great fleet to the Undying Lands, the home of the Valar. When he gazed upon its shores, he wavered for the briefest of moments, and he almost decided to turn back. Unfortunately, it seems that Ar-Pharazon's fear of death was far greater than his fear of the Valar, for he quickly composed himself and he led his mighty army upon the shores of Aman. He was ready for battle, and he declared that all of this land would become his own if there was no one with the courage to fight him for it. Ar-Pharazon would then set up camp around the hill of Tuna, and even the elves fled before the Numenorean army. There was a risk that, if he wasn't stopped, Ar-Pharazon's army could cause tremendous harm to the land and to the elves, and so Manwë called upon the LOTR, the god of Ea, to intervene and to put a stop to this attack. In that moment, Iluvatar brought down his judgment upon these men, and a great chasm appeared in the sea, and it swallowed up the entire fleet of Numenor, dragging them to the bottom of the ocean. Ar-Pharazon and his army would suffer a much worse fate, for the nearby hills and land came crashing upon them. This might sound like a quick death, though these men would actually survive this chaos, and they were imprisoned beneath the earth in the Caves of the Forgotten. They would remain trapped in this prison until the apocalypse of Arda, known as Dagor Dagorath, which marked the return of Morgoth, though we're never told if they would fight for or against the Valar in this battle. Now, I believe that this cave was located somewhere beneath Aman, probably close to Tuna, because there was actually a gap in the Pelori Mountains within this region, and so it fits quite well with how the nearby hills fell upon them. I feel that this punishment was quite a horrible experience. These men were doomed to remain trapped in this cave for thousands of years, and I can see two interpretations of this. My first interpretation is that they were trapped in a spacious cavern so that they could walk, they could talk to each other. But again, if they were trapped in this cave for thousands of years until the apocalypse of Arda, it's a horrible experience. I'm sure it's very boring, and it would be more than enough to drive someone mad. So even though it might not sound too painful, mentally it would be a very terrible experience. My other interpretation is that the Numenorean army was quite literally being crushed by the land above them. That all the ground, the earth above them, would be applying continuous pressure upon them, so they'll be kind of stuck in stasis. They can't move, they're immobile, and they just have to withstand all of this pressure, which is only made worse by the fact that they'll only be free from it after Dagor Dagorath. Of course, these are just my own interpretation of the Caves of the Forgotten, and I'd love to hear your take on them. Now, there is something which I always found really fitting about this punishment, which was its irony. So considering that Ar-Pharazon was so desperate to be immortal, with this punishment he technically got it, and he would end up being one of the longest lived beings in Arda, since he would only be freed at the end of the world. It's just so fitting that what Ar-Pharazon wanted most of all will now be his worst nightmare, and I'd wonder if it was intentional on Tolkien's part, or if it was simply a coincidence. To be fair, considering what a fantastic author Tolkien was, I imagine it was intentional. In regards to whether Ar-Pharazon would fight for or against the Valar in Dagor Dagorath, personally, I think it makes much more sense if they were allied with the Valar. After spending thousands upon thousands of years in this cave, I'd hope and imagine that they would have swallowed their pride, seen their mistakes, and acquired some insight. It would be a fitting way for them to redeem themselves by fighting against Morgoth. I also would find it quite strange if Iluvatar trapped the Numenorean army just for them to become a problem in the future, considering how important Dagor Dagorath would be. To me, it just makes much more sense that they were imprisoned to eventually serve a good purpose. After all, their army was incredibly powerful, and I'm sure that the forces of good could use their strength in the final battle against Morgoth. There is also a recurring theme in Tolkien's mythology, in which we see how the creations of evil typically end up backfiring and hurting their evil creator. For example, when Sauron created the ring, even though it helped to increase his power, it ended up causing his permanent defeat, since he had lost so much of his strength when it was destroyed that he was left as a weak, wandering spirit that could never reform. Similarly, Morgoth had infused so much of his power into his servants that it left him in a weak state, and this actually allowed the Valar to defeat him in the War of Wrath. Considering all of this, I feel that Ar-Pharazon and his army would play a similar role, that even though Sauron corrupted them and convinced them to attack the Valar, this act led to their imprisonment, and perhaps it will also lead them to fighting against Morgoth in Dagor Dagorath. I just think it would be really appropriate, and it fits well with the themes of Tolkien's mythology. On a final note, I'd like to bring up something which always hits me when I read this passage, that there were many slaves upon the Numenorean ships, and unfortunately, I imagine that all of them perished when the Numenorean fleet was sunk. After all, this isn't the Rings of Power series, and we can't expect them to swim back to Middle-earth. Jokes aside, I just hope that none of these servants were forced to join Ar-Pharazon when he landed upon Aman, because it would be horrible if they ended up imprisoned within these caverns also. It's just a weird thought that hits me whenever I read this passage, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Anyway guys, this wraps up today's video, and I hope you enjoyed it. There's so many points of discussion that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, so feel free to leave a comment below, cause we can have some really awesome discussions on this topic. For example, how do you imagine the caves to be? Is it like a continuous pressure, or would the punishment be more boredom, madness, the stress and exhaustion of eternity? Also, on whose side do you think they would fight in Dagor Dagorath, and do you agree with my interpretations? And finally, would you say this ironic punishment of, immortality, which is a horrible experience for Ar-Pharazon, do you think it was intentional on Tolkien's part, or was it simply a coincidence? So yeah, let me know in the comments below. As always, I'd like to give a quick shout out to all my patrons that choose to support this channel. Your help and support make this channel possible, and I really appreciate it. Particularly my Valar tier patrons, Michelangelo and T. Gorman, and also my Wizard tier patrons, James Tudgell, Andrew Bomer, Mike Feeney, Roland Mervold, and Zumi. If you like our work on this channel and want to support us, check out our Patreon page in the video description, where you can unlock some really cool perks. You can also support us by checking out our store, and by following us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and joining our Discord server. All of these links can be found in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.